A story can hide in plain sight for years, not because nobody saw it, but because everyone learned to look away. Tonight, we're tracing the footage people laughed off, the moments that became memes, and the warnings that got filed under industry drama. And at the center of it all is a power network, where access is currency, silence is protection, and a young star can be pulled into rooms he doesn't yet understand. Because when the spotlight finally swings back, it doesn't just expose one person, it exposes the system that kept the door closed. If you want the full timeline, stay with me and subscribe, because this gets darker the further back we rewind. For years, the warning signs didn't disappear, they just got repackaged. Awkward moments became jokes, troubling clips became memes, and the hardest questions got quietly pushed out of frame. Now, with 50 Cent forcing the conversation open again, the timeline is being replayed, slowly, carefully, and the whispers that used to fade out are stepping back into full volume. At the center sits Diddy, powerful enough to shape careers, and Justin Bieber, pulled into that orbit long before he could understand what influence really costs. This isn't about recycled hype. It's about how the truth can stay buried for years, when powerful people benefit from the silence. For years, the warning signs didn't disappear, they just got repackaged. Awkward moments became jokes, troubling clips became memes, and the hardest questions got quietly pushed out of frame. Now, with 50 Cent forcing the conversation open again, the timeline is being replayed, slowly, carefully, and the whispers that used to fade out are stepping back into full volume. At the center sits Diddy, powerful enough to shape careers, and Justin Bieber, pulled into that orbit long before he could understand what influence really costs. This isn't about recycled hype. It's about how the truth can stay buried for years, when powerful people benefit from the silence. For years, 50 Cent stayed close enough to feel the temperature, but far enough to never belong to the inner circle. And because of that, his warnings were easy to label as petty, or personal, or just marketing. But when legal scrutiny intensifies, the same old comments return heavier. Not as proof of every claim, but as a reminder. Warnings often surface long before anyone in power admits there's a fire. The uncomfortable truth is simple. Red flags are easiest to ignore when they come from a voice people prefer to silence. And that leads to the harder question. How many signs get overlooked? Not because they're baseless, but because they threaten the system that decides who gets in the room and who gets shut out without explanation. The deeper issue isn't only what happens off camera. It's what happens when success is locked behind access and protection starts to look like disobedience. In that world, authority becomes the real fault line. Who gets to say no? And who pays for it when they do? Long before Bieber became a global name, Usher described entering that same circle as a teenager, and later admitted the environment carried pressure far beyond his years. That history matters, not as gossip, but as precedent. Because when the same dynamics echo across generations, coincidence gets weaker, and pattern gets louder. If discomfort was flagged once before, the question becomes unavoidable. Why did the structure stay standing when the next young star walked into the same corridor of power? As scrutiny rose, voices that once stood nearby didn't rush to speak. They drifted into careful quiet. Because the equation is simple. Speaking up breaks alliances. Staying silent preserves them. In a world where truth competes with career survival, silence becomes the safest policy. And accountability becomes a question the system keeps dodging. So ask yourself, can real consequences exist inside a machine built to protect itself? Justin Bieber has never publicly accused Diddy of criminal conduct. But his own words about anxiety, instability, and exhaustion still add weight to a more complicated picture. He's described what it felt like, being launched into extreme pressure too young, surrounded by adults with competing interests, carrying global expectations without real protection. That doesn't hand us neat answers, but it does dismantle the easy ones and forces us to look at what growing up too fast can do inside a system that never prioritized safeguarding. This isn't about us playing judge from a screen. It's about understanding impact. Harm doesn't always show up as one headline moment. Sometimes it shows up later, as instability, as quiet strain, as a life that never fully resets. And if the pressure is baked into the structure, the damage can pile up without one perfect scene to point at. If you've ever seen the industry excuse something that felt off, hit like, and tell me in the comments, what's the red flag people dismiss too easily? When the story enters a federal courtroom, the language changes. Not rumors, records. Not vibes, filings. Indictments, rulings, and procedures define what can be responsibly said. And they widen the spotlight beyond one person, onto the institutions around the case. But courts measure conduct, not culture. And that gap is where the deeper damage can hide. Because legality and morality are not the same thing. And a procedural ending doesn't automatically repair a broken system. So even when a case closes on paper, the harder question stays open. Does accountability end at a verdict? Or does it start there? When you zoom out, past one name, past one headline, you see the same architecture repeating. Power concentrates at the top. Vulnerability sinks to the bottom. And accountability usually arrives last, if it arrives at all. Youth gets marketed as authenticity. Proximity gets sold as mentorship. Silence gets rewarded as professional. And imbalance becomes routine until it explodes. This isn't about reducing everything to one figure. It's about recognizing patterns that keep producing fallout again and again. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, share this episode, and watch the next video on what happens when fame becomes a gate and the cost is paid in private.